The club calls the mountains west of Denver. And the reason we call it the mountains west of Denver is it's sort of like mushroom hunting. We never detail exactly where we're going to collect. It's one of those kind of secret things. And so I came upon this tree, and typically what happens when you are looking at a tree is you gently come up to it. First of all, there's a real art to sneaking up on a tree so it doesn't run away while you're trying to collect it. We pretty much got that one down. And then we come up here, and I gave it a little wiggle, and a large portion of the ground covered by duff moved. That's a real good sign. That means there's a self-contained root system that's going to be collectible. So I cleared the duff off the top and work around the edges and give it one more tug and the whole thing peels off this rock. Totally intact root system with a couple that ran off this little crescent-shaped shell that it was growing in. I trimmed it off 2 roots, wrapped it in some black plastic with some tape, took it over my shoulder, and hiked a 1.5 miles back to the truck. The good news is it was mostly downhill, which is one of the wisdoms that we learn in collecting. When you pull off the road, hike uphill. So when you collect a tree, you can carry it downhill. Much easier. So this tree then has lived in my backyard for what I think of as 3 winters, which is pretty much the benchmark in Colorado. If you have a plant that's in a container and survives the winter, comes out the next spring, you pretty much got a tree that's going to live and survive forever. So without further ado, I'd like to have everyone here welcome Ryan Neil.
Thank you, Larry. So as I was walking in here, everybody's like, they're calling for you, they're waiting for you, how come you're not in there? And Larry and I had a very definitive discussion last night that there would be a meeting until 8:30 this morning, and I didn't need to be here until 8:30. So I actually thought I was early, and apparently you guys have been waiting for me. So we don't have a mic or anything, this is what I got. Okay, thank you guys for coming out this morning. It's early, 8 o'clock demo. It's not always the prime time to be up and awake, but we're going to do the best with what we got. This is a tree that was at Larry's that I've seen, and I tried to acquire before it got away from us. And he said he was saving it for this convention, so I asked him if I could be the one that demonstrated on it. He said yes. So I'm excited to work on this. Very, 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 very rare to find an exceptional quality pinyon pine. Very, very rare. So this is a unique tree to be sure, and something that we want to value. Now, when I first saw this tree, obviously the long elegance of the tree, very, very beautiful characteristics, excellent deadwood and whatnot. But when we style a tree like this, we've got to identify the characteristics that create the value. Right? What creates the value of this tree? You guys have any idea? What's your impression? Where does the value lie? In the gin, the trunk, okay. Movement. So where are we looking at as the front? What are we talking about? Potential styles, potential ideas for styling of this tree. You guys help me out. Something that highlights the deadwood. Okay, something that highlights the deadwood. So you have to cut me a little bit of slack too, because in order to get to Denver yesterday to arrange the convention and whatnot, I had to leave my house at 3:30 in the morning, which meant that I just didn't go to sleep because the chances of not waking up were very, very realistic. So I didn't sleep for almost 48 hours. Last night I got a good night's sleep, but we're still recovering from that traumatic experience. So when I look at this tree, there's a few things that I always think about when I'm coming up with the design. Okay? We've got to decide what is the feel of this tree. What kind of feel do we have here? It's kind of long, it's elegant. Okay, slightly tortured, slightly feminine, right? And if we're going to bring out the femininity in this tree, we're going to make this feel soft, long, tall, elegant, but we're going to elongate the design. We're going to keep this quite tall. The apex will be longer, right? It's never going to be a Boojin style tree, but we can definitely have a tree that has a more feminine characteristic. Okay, it'll be sort of a slender, tall, informal, upright, right? But if we want to bring character and emphasis back down to the deadwood on this tree, then we have to compact the design, bring this apex down, and we change the feel of that. No longer will it be feminine anymore. Okay? The moment that we decrease this height, we start to make this tree stronger and stronger and stronger because now we're decreasing the proportions, right? Which is going to increase the visual impact on the base of this tree. Does that make sense? So if we make this shorter, all of a sudden now the focus is placed more around this area of the tree. And I think that's actually going to be more effective for this design. So anybody can style this so that we have this long, tall apex and it looks quite elegant and nice. But would we really value this area of the tree if we left this really long and tall? And I don't think we would. So let's see today, and I'm not sure how far we'll be able to go, but we want to work within the best interest and confines of the tree. See if we can't manipulate this apex to bring it down somewhere in here so that we get closer to this portion that adds the value. What do you guys think? You up for it? Anybody else want to come up here and do it for me? Okay, so pinion pine, very flexible. Pinion pine occurs throughout the West. In terms of sap flow, pinion pines actually tend to be a very dry pine unless they're healthy, right? Dry pine because they lack moisture. So a lot of times we hear about forest fires happening. I don't know if you guys are probably all familiar with Mesa Verde. Right there for a while, the Indian ruins down Mesa Verde, very highly threatened by forest fires. And that fire was moving through the pinion pines down there because we had such a significant drought for a significant period of time. Moves through the pinion pines quite quickly like matchsticks, right? So these can be quite dry. When they're healthy, they have sap, they're flexible, so hopefully we've got a tree that's got some flex to it. And if we can get some raffia and some water, Larry, is that possible? Okay. All right, so while he's prepping that, I haven't asked, does anybody have raffia?
Andy Smith does.
Andy Smith's got raffia. All right. That's usually something I don't come without, but so while we're waiting, are you guys having a good time in Denver?
Yeah.
Yeah? All right. So I showed up, and one of my students from Philadelphia was cruising around, Karen, and she comes up and she goes, "Oh, now I understand why you like it here so much. This place is great." And I grew up on the western slope in Glenwood Springs. Born and raised, which is kind of near Aspen, so it's about 2.5 hours from Denver. And my initial impression of the Rocky Mountains and whatnot, that dictates pretty much how I approach bonsai today. And I wasn't able to quantify that until Mike Hagman and I were demonstrating on stage down in Texas. We were at the Lone Star Texas State Convention. And Mike Hagman said, you know, it's interesting how environment affects a bonsai artist, because he grew up in upstate New York, and he says, you know, the impression of the hawthorns and the apple orchards and the deciduous material present in New York had a tremendous impact on what he views and strives for in bonsai. And he said that when you walk into Ryan's backyard, it feels like you're stepping into the Rocky Mountains, even though he lives in Oregon. And so I wasn't able to quantify that, and I never would have come to that conclusion on my own. But when I think about the things, the impressions that I utilize to create bonsai, a lot of that comes from my childhood, going fishing with my dad. We always passed ponderosa pines on the way, the way the wind sounded in the pines, and the ponderosa is my most favorite species to work on. Pinion pines remind me of just hot, dry drives to Arizona and through western United States that I'm not very fond of, but I like this tree. So, he brought up this entire concept, and this is a concept I've kind of been thinking about for a while. And if you guys look at the new Bonsai Focus that's getting ready to come out, there'll be an article in there where I work on a Japanese imported juniper. Okay? So in January, I was fortunate enough and had the honor to go to Belgium to work at the Nolanders Trophy. Mark Nolanders is here today. Before leaving for that exhibition, I was working on the Rocky Mountain juniper in my workshop in Oregon. Very hard tree. I was working very hard to finish it before I left for Belgium. Got on the plane, I flew to Belgium, and at the exhibition, Mark had 2 gigantic Mugo pines for me to style on stage at the Nolanders Trophy. So for 2 days, I worked on these Mugo pines, very European, right? And then I went to Holland the evening that the exhibition was finished, and the next morning I started work on an imported Japanese juniper, right? And the thing that I noticed was how different I felt working on all 3 of those trees, or all 3 of those different situations. An American tree, highly American tree, a very representative European species, and then a Japanese imported specimen. And the way that those trees had to be worked on in order to maximize their character. And so all of a sudden I started thinking, wow, how much of an impact does culture have on bonsai? This is impressive, right? So the way that I handled the Japanese species would have never worked with the European species or with the American species, and the way that I handled the American tree would have never worked with the European tree or with the Japanese tree. And so then you start thinking about all of these skill sets that you have to be able to effectively work on these different trees, because the culture that they're born in, the culture that they come from, is the culture and the mentality that they have to be created in order to do justice to the characteristics of that tree that make them valuable. Right? So that's important to think about today with this tree as well. Right? It's not a European species, it's not a Japanese species. We're not going to style this like it was a Japanese tree. We're not going to style it like it was a European tree. We'll style this like it was born and bred in the United States. Sound good? Okay. I wonder how Larry's going with raffia. Alright, well, I'm going to get started doing some work on deadwood. It's going to be a little bit awkward because I don't really have a microphone here. Let's see.
You want to move the tree closer?
Or just move this. I'll be like the musician playing the piano. Okay, so whenever we start styling a tree like this, it's important to become familiarized with the material, right? A lot of times when we begin a piece of work like this, it's hard to know where to start, right? But starting with a bonsai tree, starting work on a bonsai tree, very much like courting a woman or a man. I'm not experienced in that, but very much like courting a woman, because we've got to go through. You can't just walk up to somebody and give them a big kiss and a hug and away you go. It doesn't work like that, right? It's not that kind of a relationship. It's got to be more intimate. And so for a bonsai tree, we're going to have a very, very in-depth relationship moving forward. There's going to be definitive getting to know each other. And the beginning of that is when I go and I start cleaning and I get to feel the tree. I see the little intricacies. I see where there's breaks. I see where there's tears. I see where there's potential weaknesses. And I want to be sure that I make myself aware of everything on this tree that's a potential characteristic I want to maximize, that's a limiting factor that I need to be careful of, that I need to be prepared to deal with, that I need to watch for as I move forward with the work. Okay? So I'm going to go through and I'm going to clean this up real quick, dead branches, dead stuff. And you guys see all of these sort of broken off, covered in bark, gins and whatnot. We get rid of that stuff first, or we deal with it first, right? We always solve structural problems first, we deal with deadwood first, we get rid of all of the unnecessary stuff first. And a lot of times that's the second, third, last thing that we do, then we go back in and we realize our tools can't quite get in there, we're bumping the things that we need in order to style the tree correctly, we can't get it done to the manner that we hope to, or we tie the guide wire to it, and now we make a big cut-off stub on our tree. Why not solve that first, so that we're prepared to move forward with the work? Okay? No, I'll take care of it. Yeah. You guys know how to prepare raffia? Yeah? Not something we need to go over? No? You want to go over it? Prepare raffia? Okay, alright. Whose is this? Can you guys hear me if I just talk like this? Is that okay? Yeah. Michael? Okay, so last thing that you want to do when you prepare a raffia is just throw it in water, right? That's an absolute no-no. The reason being, if we just put this in water, how are we going to get it untangled once it's all wet? So the wetter it gets, the harder it gets to deal with. So you always want to make sure that you have your raffia handled before you soak it in the water. So we'll unwrap this whole thing.
Okay. And then we want to take a number of strands that's appropriate for the gauge of the branch that we're going to bend. Okay, so if we have a very thin branch, the last thing we want to do is put on a significant number of strands of raffia, right? You put 20 strands of raffia on a very thin branch, it's going to be a big, large, sort of cumbersome mass that's going to be impacting the way that you bend that branch. And you don't want that, right? Why do we use raffia? Protect the branches from what? From damage, to protect the cambium, right? So raffia is a compression, right? It's a compression tool. So as we start to bend and bend and bend, all of a sudden we reach a point where we get this breakage, right? Like a torn muscle or a pulled muscle. You want to keep that muscle snug and tight. Compress that muscle so that it can't move and cause further damage. When we're bending this, right, the cambial layer, the bark, yes, we want to be sensitive to that. Does raffia solve that problem? Somewhat, but that's not really the motivation. We're trying to add compression so we avoid this moment where we get this breaking of the tissue, right? Because once we get this, our chances of survival decrease exponentially, okay? So if we're going to raffia this upper portion of the trunk here, we want to choose a number of strands that's appropriate and proportional to that. So we're going to say maybe we've got 10 or 12 strands here. And we're going to prepare this bundle to be soaked. So if we just stuck these 10 or 12 strands into the water, then when we pull them out, they're going to be all knotted up and tied up. And have we ever had that happen before? And now all of a sudden we're spending more time untying a knot than getting any work done. When you're on stage demoing, that's a pretty bad thing to have happen. Makes you look rather foolish. When we were back in Japan, we always had a very small amount of raffia hanging on a rack. And we used raffia all the time, and it always surprised me. At Mr. Kimura's place, right? He was probably one of the first people to really use raffia in the kind of abundance that he used it in, to do the significant things that he was doing. And this originated as a gardener's tool in Japanese gardens. They would wrap trunks with it. They would wrap portions of palms with it. They would wrap branches that they were going to heavily bend to protect them and apply that compression, and then they pulled that into the bonsai world from the Japanese gardening world, the Uekiya-san's world. But anyways, we would have these big, massive junipers, huge junipers, right? And we were going to bend a branch that was this big, and so we would go through all of the work and the intricate process of preparing that. And then we would have a bundle of raffia that was maybe a quarter of this hanging on the rack, you know? And he would have us start preparing raffia, and he would have us, we'd be soaking it, it would be tied up, and then we'd start wrapping it, and it was very frequently, we would get halfway through it, and then we would have no more raffia. And so he would be sitting there holding the strand saying, here, and he'd get out some money and say, run to the hardware store and pick up some raffia really quick, right? And it always amazed me when you're working at a place where you know you're going to need hundreds of pounds of raffia, that we always bought these small little bags of raffia, and that's all that we ever had sitting around. So anyways, this is what we're really looking for. Well, that's funny. Isn't that odd? You guys know where the best raffia comes from, right? What's that? Hula skirt factories. Hula skirt factories.
Cool.
Right? Raffia is what they use to make hula skirts. It's a derivative of palms, right? And when you get hula skirt factory raffia, it's very wide, right? So this is very thin. You get hula skirt factory, it's wide and it's long. It's got to extend from here down to their feet. So now all of a sudden you've got a very, very high quality raffia. Right? You can get it from wholesalers online. Look up hulaskirt.com. Dead serious. I'm not kidding. Yes.
I'm gonna write this.
The first place that I ever bought big chunks of raffia was from a hula skirt wholesaler. Yeah, there you go. If nothing else, your morning was well spent, right? Now we know. Yeah, you can. That's it, Gary. My work here is done. So why do we soak the raffia? It's very elementary. Why do we soak the raffia? We all know to put it in water, right? Why do we do that?
Make it more pliable.
Okay, it makes it pliable, makes it flexible, right? So we get a little bit of stretch. So we're trying to apply and provide compression. We don't wet this, right? Now all of a sudden we have a very brittle structure. Now you would have to work very hard to break raffia, but when you're applying raffia and you're pulling really tight and trying to get that compression, it will break. How do we know when the raffia has now become flexible, has become elastic? What's the telltale sign? It becomes transparent, the color changes, right? So as opposed to having this sort of brownish color, when we look at some of the thinner strands, they actually become quite clear. Telltale sign. Okay, so once we've got this raffia soaked, now all we have to do is untie this. Right, and it's ready to go.
Does it shrink when it dries?
Does raffia shrink when it dries? No, that's a misconception. Right? It doesn't shrink when it dries, and quite the contrary. If we apply raffia when it's wet, we get that compression as we tighten it, we get that elasticity, right? And then we let that raffia dry before we bend it. We're going to have a much less compressive nature in the raffia. So when you apply raffia, it's still wet, it's tight, then you bend it. Because if you wait, you let it dry out, you've lost the impact of that raffia. Okay? So a lot of times what would happen in Japan is Mr. Kimura would say, here, apply raffia to this, we're going to bend it. And as apprentices, you would be applying raffia, and he would go up front and he would be talking on the phone, doing business, something would be happening. He would come back, the raffia would be applied, it would have dried out, and then he'd say, well, you did a crappy job, look at how loose this is. And you'd be sitting there thinking, God, I could have sworn that I did a good job. I really worked hard to make that tight. Right? But as it dries out, it loses that compression. So you got one shot. Yes? You spray it to keep it wet. Now you just bend it as soon as you've applied it. Okay, so I'm going to clean this up really quick. Just a few sort of insignificant branches. The first time that I ever was given the task or the job of applying raffia, Mr. Kimura had bought a very, very expensive juniper. And nobody would buy it because structurally it was a little bit flawed. And so he had grafted all of these new branches onto it. And once I had gotten there, this was maybe my first week of my apprenticeship. All of these new branches had been grafted maybe 6 months prior, which if any of us know anything about approach grafting a juniper, 6 months is too fast to cut off the old foliage and utilize the new stuff, right? But because he was always pushing the envelope, he said, I'm going to cut this off, the grafts have taken, I feel quite confident about it. So he cut off all of the old foliage, right? Cut off the roots of the new grafts, cut off the old foliage, so now we have new foliage, and this is a very young graft. And then he gives me the raffia, and he says, here, raffia these joints so that when I style this and bend this, they don't break, they don't die, right? We don't want separation of this. And I've never applied raffia. And he never taught me how to apply raffia. I had no idea what I was doing. And so me and the guy above me, who had started 2 months prior to me, are applying raffia to this tree, and we're sweating and we're worried and scared, and every time that one of our hands slips on the raffia, we both kind of jump because we thought we've removed one of the branches. And so we managed to get through 2 or 3 branches, and then all of a sudden I'm going, and I see that my senpai, the older guy, had stopped. And I look up and he's holding one of the branches in his hand, and the graft had separated. Right? And so Mr. Carrera comes out and he's smoking his cigarette and looking at how things are going, and the guy's kind of holding the branch down low, you know, like he didn't want Mr. Carrera to see what had just happened. And he's looking at a branch and he can see that the branch has been cut off and there's no graft on it. And he's looking at it, and he's looking at it, he's looking at me, and I'm just sitting there raffing, not looking at him because I don't want to be responsible for this situation that's just started to happen. And the other guy's kind of holding the branch down low and acting like he's kind of doing something, staying busy, so that he's hoping Mr. Kimura moves on and he can cut it off and throw that branch away. Needless to say, he got busted. But that was the icebreaker for me because I didn't have any skins in that game. I was good. Okay. So when we apply raffia, we've always got to be thinking about how we're going to rotate this branch when we bend it, right? So our front, we're obviously going to utilize this deadwood. Even before thinking about angles, even before thinking about shapes, we're going to set the structure because we've identified that we want to increase the visual significance around this feature of the tree, correct? Are you guys with me?
Yep.
We like that. That's a good idea? Okay, all right. So we're going to bring this apical area down as close to this as possible so that we increase the amount of visual appeal here, which means that we've got to bring this down like so. But as we bring it down, we never just bend. Never just bend, right? We always bend and twist slightly. So once we apply a twist, as we bend, we distribute the force of that bend along a greater distance, along a greater number of strands of vascular tissue, increasing our potential to bend without breaking, okay? So when we have that rotation, our wire, or our raffia application and our wire should all follow that same rotation. Does that make sense? Yeah? So when we're going to rotate this, you guys tell me, how are we going to be rotating this as we bend it? Clockwise or counterclockwise? Clockwise? Okay, very good. So we're going to bring it down like so, right? And you guys thought raffia was simple. What's that? Nothing's simple, that's right. I was in Italy and I was doing a demonstration on a Scots pine. And one of the things Mr. Kimura used to always tell me about raffia, he said if you're going to apply raffia, you need to make it look nice. You need to make it look so nice that people don't even notice that it's on there, right? And I did a photo shoot for Bonsai, the Kenbon Bonsai, the Japanese magazine. My first photo shoot, he gave me a juniper from Mr. Iwasaki. And I don't know if you guys know who Mr. Iwasaki is. Mr. Iwasaki was one of sort of the last real sponsors of the bonsai community in Japan. He just passed away recently. He had a very, very famous bonsai garden that I'm sure if you guys have been to Japan on a tour with Bill Valbanis or with Ben Oki, you guys may have seen, or the Friendship Federation. Used to always go to Mr. Iwasaki's. He was a big supporter of the WBFF. Anyways, it was a very, very prominent little juniper. It was small, and he liked big trees, so maybe Mr. Kimura thought if Ryan screws it up, it's not going to be totally devastating to Mr. Iwasaki. But it was an expensive piece of material. Mr. Kimura told me it was a $10,000 piece of material. And this was the first tree that I was ever going to do a photo shoot live on, right? So Kenbon had come and they said, we need to kind of mix up the content of our magazine. We would like to do a photo shoot with your foreign apprentice. And he was not excited about that because when you're an apprentice, you don't get recognized or recognition for apprenticing, right? That's a normal thing. You have to wait till you finish your apprenticeship to gain that recognition. So he was not a fan of that, but Kenbon, it's good to him. He was a client, right? They were paying him to do the photo shoot, so he said okay. And he gave me this very, very expensive little juniper, extremely expensive. And he said, I want you to think about how you're going to design this tree. So I spent a good part of 3 days looking at this tree. When he would go out at night, I would pull it into the workshop. Of course, I had butterflies in my stomach that made me feel like I wanted to vomit because I was so nervous. And I knew that this juniper was going to take a significant amount of bending to make it as good as it could possibly be. So we sat down and we kind of had a powwow about how we were going to style this juniper, right? How I was going to style it. He said, what do you think? And I told him my potential ideas. And it meant that I was going to have to hollow out one of the branches, put wire inside of it as a support system, and then bend it. And it was the branch that supported all of the foliage on the tree. And so he said, I think that's a good idea. You know, can you do that? He asked me if I could do that. Because it's not like he ever gave us that kind of work. When that kind of work needed to happen, he was the one who did it. And then we watched and we learned, we assisted, we prepared the raffia, we always pulled the guy wires, stuff like that. But it wasn't something that he gave us repetition doing. So he said, can you do that? And I said, well, that's a good question. I've never done anything like that. But the one thing that Mr. Kimura always understood about me was that when he would go out at night or when I would go home and he would go out later, he drove right by my apartment to wherever he was going out to, right? And I would be up in my apartment working in the spare room in my apartment on my own trees, and he saw that every time that he went out. And so he knew that the things that I was doing up there, I was practicing for moments like that, or to have the ability to do that kind of work. And so when he asked me to do that, I said, I don't know if I could do it. He said, well, I think you ought to try. Okay? So the photo shoot was supposed to be 2 months, right? 2 months after he sort of assigned me that work. So we decided what was going to happen, and for 2 months I sat there and I stewed over this project. I was nervous, I just wanted to get it out of the way. It was haunting my mind. I couldn't sleep at night, the anxiety was killing me. He would make continual reference to it because he was not happy that it was happening in the first place. And I just wanted the whole thing to be over. So 2 days prior to the photo shoot, I'm going to work in the morning, and as I get there I notice that there's a van that looks a lot like the Kimbone photo people's van. And I'm thinking, they must have come early, maybe they were in Tokyo, but we're not doing the photo shoot until tomorrow. So I've got on horrifically dirty clothes, right? I'm unshaven and probably sleep deprived because I'm so anxious about this photo shoot. And lo and behold, the equipment is set up and Mr. Kimura says, you're late, it's your photo shoot today. So I kind of panic and run to the back and set up my tools, and the whole time I'm thinking, what the, you know? Anyways, he did it intentionally because he knew how stressed out about it I was. He told me it was a day later than it really was, so I came completely unexpecting to do the photo shoot, therefore negating a lot of the nerves that I would have had I been thinking about it for another day. It's like when a doctor says this is going to hurt 1, 2, and then they stick the needle in, right? You never get to 3 because you're waiting for 3 and they stick it in on 2. That was an interesting tactic. Anyways, he was in the back for about 10 minutes. You sure you're okay? You know what you're doing? Right? You never say yes. You never say I can do this. You never say yes, I'm fine. Anyways, he watched for a minute as I hollowed out the branch. And then he said, okay, I'll be up front if you need me. He went back up front and I didn't see him again for the rest of the day.
So how tight are
How tight am I wrapping? So when we apply raffia, the biggest issue is not maintaining tension as we apply it, right? We don't want to maintain tension as we apply it because it makes it very, very difficult for us to get a good, even distribution of the raffia on the branch. The big kicker with raffia is that we apply tension after each wrap. So you notice that I apply a wrap, and then I support the trunk, and then I apply that compression pull, right? So then I'll apply this wrap, not letting slack enter the system, but being sure that I get this put down so that I have an attractive product, get that wrap, apply that compressive pull. That's the appropriate way to apply raffia. That's how we get a clean product, even distribution of the raffia across the branch, and make sure that we maintain tension. You see a lot of times, you see a lot of people talking about all of these ulterior methods in applying raffia, right? We've got horse wrap and duct tape and tire rubber and any number of things to avoid having to go through the process of learning how to appropriately apply raffia. A lot of people say, have you ever used horse wrap, or have you ever used, you know, medical tape, or have you ever used this or that? I believe one of the things I saw in Europe was like a twine that they were wrapping around things. They soaked this twine in water and wrapped twine around it. Raffia is about the cleanest product you can get in terms of discreetness, cleanliness, and functional capability to apply compression. But learning how to apply it correctly, that's the key.
How did you start it to think of that first part before you started to wrap?
Sure. So if we have two branches, right? Or if we have a trunk and a branch, we always want to make sure that we pin this raffia below our first wrap, okay? So I'll bring this around and I'll make sure to maintain this sticking out vertically, so I wrap around that one time, okay? So as I apply this up the branch, now I can cut this knot off and it's secure, okay? But you always need something, an anchor point to wrap around so that you can apply this and wrap over your raffia here, right? So never would you take this and leave your raffia down like this and then wrap over it like so. Okay, that's never going to be appropriate. You cut that off, you're always going to see this. So you should always be covering all of your cuts. You should always be covering all of your joints. You should never see where the union of raffia occurs on the tree, right? It should be as beautiful as the wire, the style of the tree. We're trying to create something beautiful here, right? We don't want to create some aesthetic sort of knot or some aesthetic catch-all for our eye. If we can make a smooth transition, it becomes invisible. Okay. So we're raffia. Now let's see if we can get this guy bent. What do you say? Okay. So when we start thinking about bending, now we're going to be thinking about either thick wire or guy wires, right? This type of bend, this would require 4 gauge to do it correctly. So we always apply the gauge of wire that's going to allow us to bend it as far as we want to bend it, right? One of the most mispracticed things I see as I travel the United States is we use too small of a gauge of wire and we never get the branch to where we want it to go. So what do? More wire, more wire, more wire. And what happens to the visual quality, aesthetic quality of our work? Every time we apply one more gauge of wire, we get gaps, the wire's not together now, we've got more wire on the branch, the quality of our work decreases, right? So the gauge of wire that we want to accomplish the bend, one piece of wire, right? We don't have that wire here, so now we've got to think about something else. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we rig up guy wire to get this bent in a manner that's going to be effective, okay? So I've got 3 prominent branches at the top. We see this? 3 prominent branches, okay? I'm going to wire 2 of these branches together with a significant heavy wire, and then I'm going to anchor to that wire with a guy wire so that we can pull that down. So that decreases any wire on this portion of the trunk that's completely pointless now because we don't have any gauge that can bend this. So why would we put wire on that portion of the trunk, right? So we're going to apply our wire here, guy wire from here, and then we're going to pull down to one of these gins down here and see if we can get this bent. We all on board?
Yep.
Okay. So when we apply this guy wire, right, it's very, very common for us, we'll wire and then we'll hook it to a loop on that wire and then we're going to pull against that. What's the problem with doing that? It's the problem that always happens. We hook to a piece of wire and we pull against that. It loosens it, pulls the wire away from the trunk. What's that? Creates a point force, okay. So how do we avoid that with the guy wire, right? So we've got this wire wrapped around our trunk and we pull like this and it pulls and pulls and pulls and pulls away from the branch. We see how that happens? We don't want to do that. Now we've got a big gap in our wire. What do we want to avoid with wire? Gaps, right? So we've just defeated the purpose, okay? We're going to solve that situation. Okay, so if you can see, now when we pull this, we're pulling the wire into the branch. Does that make sense? Do you guys see this setup? No. So I'm pulling the wire into the branch. So the wire actually exists here. Okay? And it's run right through the crotch of these two branches. Take a look at it later. Okay? So what I've got, this is important. Okay, so I've got my wire here on my two branches. We see this portion here. We run the guy wire right down between that crotch. So now when I pull, I'm pulling this against these two branches, right? Distributing the force across two locations where that wire is in contact with the branch and pulling it into it so that I don't get that gap. Does that make sense? Yes. You see that? So it's from the top, right, not from the bottom. Right, this is fundamental guy wire usage. It's something that nobody's ever taught me, right? I went to Japan, this is how we guy wired anything when we were using thick wires, right? Now sometimes we'll have a situation where we need to lower it from here. Now we use rubber and guy wire, and we all know how to do that. But this is clean, there's no rubber, it's very, very, very uninvolved, right? Simple solution. It's a little technique, take home. The morning is worth it, just for that. What's that? There you go. You're having a good morning. One of the other things that's highly unpracticed in bonsai, and I know you guys aren't here for a lecture on what we need to learn how to do, but kind of you are here on a lecture about what we need to learn how to do, right? You want to learn how to do bonsai better. If I just stood up here and told entertaining stories and didn't actually show you or talk to you about what I was doing, you would get very little out of this experience, right? And we're here to learn, okay? The usage of pliers, right? When you start doing heavy work on trees, when you start manipulating structure, no longer are we talking about finer branches. Anybody can wire thin, fine branches. We get that. We've got the gauges of wire to cover that scope of our work. But when we start manipulating structure, the use of our pliers and the use of guy wire, absolutely, absolutely imperative to be able to do this correctly, right? So when we were in Japan, we used to always assist Mr. Kimura when he would be setting the structure on trees. That's how you learn. You see how he handles things, you see where the wire and where the rubber goes, you see where he applies the pressure, the leverage, how he gets the angles on the branches, what he's looking for, how we get these bends, how we hold these bends, how we secure these things. That's all an important part of bonsai, right? But it all stemmed from being able to use this one tool. Very simple plier, right? Not very fancy. It's not Masakuni. It's a $5 hardware store special, right? And so the first time that I got down and I was going to help him pull guy wires, it was my first week, and I had my fancy pair of gin pliers, right, that I had bought at the bonsai convention prior to going to Mr. Kimura's place, and I had these pliers, and I got down and I grabbed it, and he said, wait. So this is a fast-paced operation, very aggressive. We're setting the structure on this tree, and I get down there, and he says, whoa, stop, hold. What the hell are those? And I said, it's my pliers, you know, like, I did well, right? I got good pliers. And he said, Urushabata-san, take Ryan to the hardware store. Urushabata-san was my senpai. He said, take Ryan to the hardware store and get him a real pair of pliers. So we had to walk to the hardware store. We bought this exact pair of pliers. We come back, and he was just sitting there smoking a cigarette in the same spot in the workshop waiting for us. And we come back, real pair of pliers. I showed it to him. He looked at them, examined them as if he had never seen them before, even though he knew exactly what I was buying. And he said, yes, that is a good tool. He handed it back to me, and then we were able to proceed with work. I was now one of the gang, right? But as he was always teaching us, we would always have our plier in our hands. 3 tools that we never went anywhere without. Your wire cutters, your pliers, and your scissors, right? They're the 3 tools that these were in our pockets continually. Running through the garden, we'd have our pliers and our wire cutters. Everybody would always be holding their butt as they were running so these didn't fall out. And our scissors, if you put them right here in your pocket, it's amazing how these will never ever move from this location, okay? Always here and here, anywhere that we went. But as he was teaching, you would always have the pliers in your hands, and you'd always be working on twisting the pliers in your hands, because you knew when you had the opportunity to assist him, when he was doing heavy work, if you could not handle pliers, he would kick you out of the room. Get out of the way, you're now no longer helping, and in fact, you're in the way. Okay, so if you could use pliers well, he said pull this, you get down there, use your pliers really well, all of a sudden you can help, you can be a part of things, you're one of the guys. So we were always working on our pliers, holding the pliers vertically and not allowing them to slip, right? Holding them upside down and not allowing them to fall out of our hands. Using both directions so that you make sure that you don't drop them if you have to twist inways. He always twisted in, I always twisted out. You had to be able to do both. And then moving them to your left hand. Because sometimes he's going to be in a position where now all of a sudden you're going to be at an opposite side of the tree and he's got a big piece of rebar bending this and he's saying pull this, pull this, pull this, and you're sitting there going shit, right? Plier work.
Why are these type of pliers better than gym pliers?
Why are these better than gym pliers? Because you've got a wider width to grab the wire with. Okay? Gym pliers come to a point. So when you go to grab wire and you're twisting wire, all of a sudden that wire starts coming out diagonally and now you're twisting it and it's kind of messed up and now you've got to adjust and let go, and we didn't have the opportunity to do that. You grab it, you've got this much width for that wire to have play in, but it allows you to have a lot more accuracy with less effort. Okay? Alright, so let's see if we can get this bent successfully. Nobody freak out if it breaks, because I'm sure it'll survive. How'd we do? Better?
Yeah.
Better? Okay. So as we're bending, we've always got to be aware of where is the stress occurring, right? So you noticed I was watching, I was moving it very closely. I adjusted my hands a few times to try and distribute the force across different locations on that branch, right? Now that's very important because, interestingly enough, you guys think that it would break right here, right? Right? Naturally, we would think it would break right here. Where is it actually going to inflict the most damage? Right here. Right here, at the base of where that leverage is applied, okay? So there's actually very little force being applied right here, okay? But if you guys take a look later, you can see that we're starting to get the tissue just slowly opening up, separating, right? So this brings me to another point when we start bending. You have to know how the vascular tissue in your tree works, right? When we're dealing with pines, we know pines can move resources laterally as well as vertically. It's why very rarely do we get a continuous vein of deadwood up the entire trunk. Now we know with ponderosa pines we see that from time to time, but it's rare. That's why those are special, that's why those are highly prized trees. For the most part, when we get damage in a pine, we get compartmentalization of that damage. Resources move around it, heal that wound from all sides, which is why we get this callousing around the entire circumference of this deadwood, right? Moves around it and we're good to go, okay? The second thing that we've got to know is that where are pines going to be weak? Where would they tear? Where would they break if they're going to break? At the crotch, okay? Always at the crotch. So a juniper very rarely breaks at the crotch. If it does, it happens quickly. If we bend a juniper, this will open up the first thing. Pines, they will bend and bend and bend and bend and bend, and then all of a sudden they'll separate like that, right? So when we're bending, we've got to be watching that crotch. We've got to be making sure, okay? But pines will inevitably tear like this, okay? The fibers tear like this. As long as we still have union and junction of these fibers, as long as we don't totally separate that, we've got the viability for this to survive, okay? Very different than a juniper. Junipers just break, which is why we use raffia on junipers a lot more than we do on pines, okay? So I see here I'm starting to get the separation of some tissue right here at the junction of this branch and this major section of trunk. I'm going to push this a little bit farther just so we open it up and maximize our bend, and then we'll stop for the day, okay? I'll be done. You guys can take a look at the work. Okay, so that's about as far as we can go, right? That's as far as we can go there, but notice how we have this very unattractive loop. Do you see that? Nah, it's not good. I don't like that. Do you like that? No, I don't like that. Are we all in agreement that we can do better than that? Yeah? So what do we do now? What happens if we pull from here to here? And now apply the pressure on the bend here. Compress that loop without applying any more tension here. Yeah? Let's try that. What time is it?
9:15.
9:15. And what time do I have till 11? 11:30. Well, you guys are excited. Be with me a long time today. No, I promise I won't make it take that long. How's that? All right, let's try this again.
What is that looped around?
The same piece of wire that it was, the first one was looped around. Same location and everything. So now I've got to be careful about this junction here, right? Because now the application of force is across this bend. And we've got this crotch, and we said pines are weak at the crotch. That's right. Okay, I've got to be careful of this right here.
But you can't see the stress there, can you?
You can feel it.
How do you know what's too much?
How do you know what's too much? Well, you hope that you stop before it breaks, because then that would have been too much, right? Too much is saying, as you bend and the experience that you've had, is it tearing or is it bending smoothly? You can feel it, right? You can feel something start to give and tear because the tension decreases. So when you're bending and you feel the tension start to give, you feel it start to decrease, it means something has happened. Even if you've got raffia covering it, you've got all of this tension, and then all of a sudden that tension releases. You probably pushed it to the point or maybe just past where it was really safe, probably still acceptable, if you continue moving past that point, you have no control over what happens, right? Okay. How'd we do? Better? Yeah. Sharper bend? Yeah? So it's always going to be round. But when we're looking at this tree, chances are we're looking at this tree from right in here where this wire is, right? So we have this bend. We have this bend that's like this. But the front of our tree actually sees that bend from here, which makes that bend look significantly sharper than it really is, right? This brings me to one more point before I stop kind of BSing you guys.
Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm just filling airspace now, right? No, this is important. Anybody can bend something, right? It's no mystery. Anybody can bend something. You take something, you bend it, and everybody high fives. We bent it, we bent it, we bent it. Nice job, guy, good game, right? That doesn't mean that it was effective. We have to make something look attractive for the design that we're trying to implement with this tree. So we bend and we bend and we bend, and it looks like crap. That didn't get us anywhere, right? So one of the things that I notice most as I travel around the country, as I go to Europe, other places in Japan, people bend things and then they're in magazines, or they do photo shoots, or they do demonstrations, and everybody's happy and that was an amazing bend. Okay? But the problem is it looks bad, right? So anytime that you're bending something, you gotta be thinking about two things: the survivability and the success of the operation from a technical standpoint, and the aesthetic results of what you've done, right? So we said this bend was a little bit too long. We tightened it up from a different angle, and now all of a sudden, from our front that we're gonna create this tree at, which is right around this point right here, we've got what looks like a very sharp bend, right? From what was a very straight apex. And now our foliage is down around this portion of the tree that we said is the most valuable. We wanted to increase visual interest around. Now we can actually start to design our tree. Up to this point, everything was theoretical, right? We know what we wanted to get to, but we didn't know how it was gonna go. Now the structure is set, now let's design.
So Ryan, the initial guy wire is now off. Is
right.
it not neat, so it doesn't matter.
Doesn't need it anymore. Okay, so now let's take a look at this. How do we style this tree from this point moving forward? Is this branch important? Is this branch important? Is this branch important? All things that we need to start figuring out. What do you think? No, no, no? No, yes, no? Yes, no, no?
I would concentrate on the lower branch.
You're going to concentrate on this. Okay, so this is going to be the core of our design, right? Do we need anything in here?
No.
No?
Well, in the back.
You want something in the back here?
Yeah.
Depth? Want some depth? Okay. If we were in Europe, right, and this is not a gross generalization of all European artists, some European artists have a very fundamental understanding of this, but something that you see in a lot of magazines. We would use everything moving this way and we would leave this totally void, right? That would feel very, very European in my mind, okay? Now in Japan, we would have the apex somewhat over the middle of the tree, we would have this branch be long, and we would have another branch here that would balance that out very, very well, okay? So it would be balanced, and in Europe we'd be significantly lopsided. I think the United States kind of has to combine the better of the two worlds, right? So we need something here, but we definitely don't want this. We don't want this, so we kind of find that medium middle ground today, right? That's what we're gonna work towards, right? So I know that I've got a very delicate situation here at this crotch. Is this branch important for us? Do we want to use this branch? Yes, absolutely, that's definitive. Gotta use it, okay? I think this branch is gonna fill that space quite nicely, okay? Quite nicely. And then we've got this branch here. Is this a branch that we want to use? Potentially a back branch, right? Now this is a very, very difficult angle. How are we going to use this? We're going to just have to see how this works out. So what we're going to do is we're going to push this branch as far as it can go, right? Maybe it breaks. If it breaks, oh well, we didn't need it. We've got some branches here that can fill that void. We bring these over, use this in this location. We can still have that back branch that gives us depth, right? But if we bend it and it's successful, okay, all right. We have an out if we fail, which means we can push it a little bit farther, okay? Any questions? You guys on board? Get on with it, they say. Does anybody know anything about pinyon pine? Pinyon pine is bonsai, the timing, how they operate, the things they like, the things they don't like. What's that? Full sun. Okay, they like full sun. So as we said, pinyon pine, very, very dry pine. They come from some of the drier areas in the United States where we still have vegetation. Right? They can handle drought. But once we put them into a bonsai container, it's like anything else. One of the biggest misnomers that you hear, this tree comes from the desert, it doesn't like water. You hear that in California a lot, the California junipers. These come from the desert, they don't like water. If you water them too much, they will die. Is that true? Okay, so ponderosa pines come from dry, exposed hillsides. Does that mean that you shouldn't water a ponderosa very much? No? What do you guys say? All these Colorado folks that deal with ponderosa, what do you say? Water? Water. They love water, right? So just because a tree can tolerate, right? Tolerate a condition doesn't mean it prefers that condition. It's necessary to understand that. Even though a pinyon pine comes from a very dry environment, it doesn't mean that it wants to be dry. It means that's what it can endure in order to occupy that location and not be outcompeted by another species, right? Competition. Everybody wants the nicest house. A pinyon pine might want to grow by the ocean where it's nice and cool and it gets rain and enjoys that, but it's not as strong as those other species, right? It can tolerate the conditions where it's occupied and naturalized itself and not be outcompeted. We understand that?
Ryan, sometimes people say that trees from higher altitudes, maybe this is the same sort of idea, that they prefer that higher altitude and they don't do well at lower altitudes.
Okay. So the question was, sometimes people say trees at higher elevations prefer a higher elevation and don't do well at lower elevations. Is this true?
No.
There would be multiple conditions at a high altitude. It isn't just the altitude, I would say.
Okay. Okay. So I think that this is true to an extent. The necessary thing to understand is as we increase in elevation, we decrease in the duration of the growing period. So you have trees that are genetically geared towards producing one flush of growth rapidly before they get to a point where they have to shut down, right? And when we bring those into a condition where they now have a longer growing period, that cycle of growth is thrown off. I can grow and I should be shutting down now, but I can still grow. And that's where we start to get confusion. You see ponderosa pines push 2 sets of buds when we take them to warmer climates sometimes. Or you see them become exhausted and fatigued over time because their cycle of growth is not geared towards that expansive period, that expansive growing season, right? And so I think you do have to be careful with that. That would very much be not a misnomer in my mind. Now there are thresholds, always thresholds to how much dormancy, how much rest, how much off time a tree has or needs, right? If you can meet those requirements, then I think it's successful to grow any species anywhere, right? But it's a matter of meeting those requirements for that tree to be able to clean itself. So we're lacking the gauge of wire that we really want, but we'll work with it, okay? If this looks horrible, it's because I didn't have the right wire.
What gauge do you need?
4,
And you have?
6,
Okay.
6 from a different, a lighter gauge 6 than you really want. Okay. So when we look at this design, we've got to create some sort of asymmetry, right? Do we know anything about dynamic design? Anything about dynamic design? A little bit. A little bit. We want to know more, right? Right, Gary? A little bit more? Okay, so when we start talking about dynamic design, anytime we have the apex of the tree immediately over the center of the tree, regardless of what happens in here, it's no longer dynamic. Because we haven't made the tree move, right? But the second that we take this, and now we go like this, we've got to counter that movement, right? We've got to now bring this branch to here, we've got to move the apex to here, and now all of a sudden we've got some tension, we've got asymmetry, and we've got something dynamic, okay? So whenever we're creating a tree, if we can create that offset motion and counterbalance that with the movement of our branches, the foliage mass, we've created something interesting. You guys want to know how Mr. Kimura derives all of the creativity and the dynamic interest in his trees? That's your formula. Take this away from this, which all of the bonsai books tell us is quality design, right? Take that away and then counterbalance that. Now all of a sudden we've got something interesting. Now maybe we have a tree where we move this way and we say we're going to go like this, okay? And create a very soft, nice, natural flow. Now we've got to have the characteristics here, the footing, to anchor that, right? If we don't, it's going to feel like it's going to fall over. If we've got it, very capable of taking part in that design, right? If you guys were part of the critique yesterday, Mark made a very important point. He said, in a tree, generally the apex and the main branch always follow each other, right? How those two elements interact with the movement of the trunk is what creates the feel in your tree. So if your trunk moves this way, your apex and your main branch move this way, everything moves in the same direction. It's a soft design, right? Elegant, harmonious. We like to sip coffee and look at it, it's calming. But the second that our trunk moves this way, our apex and our main branch move against that, now we've created visual tension. We've gone against the strongest portion of our trunk in terms of establishment of character. If we want to add interest, if we don't have the elements to balance this movement this way, we bring it back to establish that balance. That make sense? So as we're kind of working on this tree, we may get to a point where we say, you know what, we need to tilt it a little bit more, we need to do something else. For now, we're going to put the elements in place, having a general idea of our design, and then we're going to utilize and tweak those to maximize the potential and the interest of this. Sound good? So you guys are going to help me. But this first branch, I know that this branch has to be as tight in here as possible. Now maybe we can move this out if we need to establish the flow coming back against the tree. We haven't decided that yet, right? We're going to see how those elements come together. We're going to do it together, so you guys get to be a part of this. The other thing, notice the spin on this branch. You see how it's up like this? If we're going to utilize this branch, we're going to drop it down like this, yeah? Notice that the turn of the wire is in the same direction. Okay? So I could have wired this from here, or I could have wired it from here. What dictated the direction of that wire was getting this branch in the correct location based on how I have to rotate it. All things that we've got to think about as we're designing a tree. Okay, so this isn't necessarily attractive, but it's utilizable, right? Because from the front, we notice that now that's become quite a dynamic little aspect of our design, that branch in the back. We fan those branches out, all of a sudden it's going to be like, ooh, that's a nice little detail there. Okay? Let's get these guys set. Do we need this? Yes. Yes. Yeah? Okay. No, for the crown. For the crown. Okay? We'll think about it. Let's use it.
gauge wire are you using there, Ryan?
8 gauge. It's a little bit light for this branch, but because we're wiring it to this one, we made the exception and we twisted as we bent to harden the wire a little bit more. Okay, we'll leave this one. This is sort of this is going to be our lingering concept of what could be an apex, but probably not. We'll see what happens with these branches here. Okay, now we've got this guy, this branch here. Now if we're going to utilize this guy, we need to rotate this over like so. Do we see that? Now we can bring these branches here, utilize those in the upper portion of our tree. But the only place that we have to combine it to is down here. We would have an opposite rotation from what we're looking for, right? We'd be spinning it the opposite way. So we're actually going to anchor this here, even though we've got these branches down here, and then we'll wire these two in tandem. This is just design strategy, right? When we used to wire structure with Mr. Kimura, there'd be a big tree on his turntable. And sometimes when we were first learning, he would take chalk, and the color of the chalk was indicative of the gauge of wire, that the combination to be wired in, right? But then as we got older, he would just say, wire these two, wire this like this, and wire this like this, and you had to remember all of that, right? And inevitably, you could never remember it all, and he would be spinning the tree rapidly, and there's 5 million branches, right? So you learned very quickly, if you had a little tissue, you tore off tissue, you could stick it in the little foliage pad so that you at least had some idea of what he was talking about. But if you didn't think about where those branches were going, you'd wire it and he would turn around and look at it, and inevitably his reaction would be, "Are Sky Naiyo, I can't use this. Why did you do this? You put no thought into this." And as you see me wiring this structure, notice that the structure is set every time each branch is wired. We don't wire this entire tree and then style it, right? We set the branch that we wire every single time it's finished being wired, okay? So now I know where everything else has to go. I know what spin has to be put on that branch. I know how it's going to be positioned. And then once I've wired the structure, I can start wiring the finer branches because all of the structure is set. Setting the structure is 90% of the work. Once it's set, we have an idea. Now we make the nice small branches look nice, complement the different areas of the tree, create our foliage pads. But this portion of it is the largest scope of work. Because if we do this well, anybody can wire the finer branches. Mr. Kimura used to say a monkey can wire the finer branches, right? Which is very discrediting to an apprentice. Okay, so let me talk to you about my thought process now. As I continue to look at this branch here, this is kind of the branch that's hanging out here, and it's making us wonder, do we really want to use you or not, right? Now my feelings for this, why would we not want to use this? We see the structure of this. Does it really have that much on there that's valuable for us? Does it have the kind of ramification, the strength? Does it have the quality that we're looking for to form the apical, one of the most important parts of our tree? Not really, okay? Now the reason that I would keep it, because the apical area would have to be formed with this branch right here, okay? Now the interesting thing about this is if we form the apical area with this branch actually occurs lower than this branch, right? Is that okay? Is that okay? Well, maybe. Maybe, right? Maybe, maybe not. Could we make it look nice? Yes. Is it going to be a bit superficial? Yes. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to cut both of these off. It's better already?
Yeah.
Okay. Now we know we don't need this.
Right.
And there's the structure of our tree. You see it? Okay. Now, one of the things that I also want you to understand, when you look at this, there's a very definitive front for this tree now. As I spin this around, you see that very definitive front. What makes you know that it's definitive? What delineates that as the front? The most important portion of the tree is framed by the main branches, right? There is no arguing, there should be no misconception that anywhere other than right here between these two foliage masses is now your front, right? So this is another important aspect of design. Foliage is used to highlight, frame, accentuate. We said we're going to bring this entire thing down so that we could highlight this portion of the trunk. How do we do that? We move that foliage around that portion that we want to accentuate, right? Now we're going to style the branches to really frame it. We're going to bring these up so that we show this little gin here. We're going to bring this in here so that we cover that negative space, so you have no choice but to see the best point on this tree, right? That's your job as a designer, as a bonsai artist, as a bonsai professional, as a hobbyist. If you're maximizing the potential, you're forcing people to see the points on the tree that you find to be the most beautiful, the most enjoyable, the most important, okay? The paint on a canvas. This is your foliage, this is your paint. This is how we create a tree. This is design. Okay, so I'm going to go about wiring. I'll stand up here and talk if you guys want to hear me talk. If not, I can stop. It shouldn't take long to wire this, not too many branches. But now, after creating this complicated structure, my priority changes significantly. No longer do I want to have as many wiggles, as many interesting contours. I want the structure of this, these finer branches, I want these guys to be quite simple. Because if we take this complicated structure all the way out into these finer branches, now we've just created something too busy. So at some point in this tree, we've got this tortured trunk, we've got these branches that are curved and manipulated. At some point, we've got to have something that's simple, something that's very common and standard and clean. And that comes in the structure of our finer branches. So where we have this, now we're only going to have this, right? These aren't old enough to be tortured yet. They're not old enough to be curved and manipulated and twisted. They're still the new growth that's looking for the light, innocent, unharmed, unjaded by the harshness of the world, right?
So poetic.
Wasn't that beautiful?